You've been trained your whole life to avoid looking stupid. Don't ask the dumb question. Don't take the weird risk. Don't be that person. And because of that, because you've spent years shrinking yourself to look competent and composed, there is a part of you that is slowly dying. And the most disturbing thing? The people throughout history who changed everything, who healed others, who lived fully, they all had one thing in common. They were willing to be the fool. Here's the question that's going to haunt you by the end of this video. What if the smartest thing you could ever do is to stop trying to look smart? There's a psychological concept so old it predates written language, and yet it explains something that is happening inside you right now. Carl Jung called them archetypes, ancient, universal patterns of behavior that live inside every human being regardless of culture, era, or upbringing. And among all of these patterns, the hero, the shadow, the sage, none is more misunderstood, more feared, or more desperately needed than the archetype of the fool. Now, before you think this is about clowns or comedy, stop. Because what psychology actually reveals about the fool will completely flip the way you see yourself, the people around you, and why your life might feel stuck in a way you can't quite explain. The fool is not who you think he is. Let's start with what modern psychology keeps running into over and over again. The people who make the biggest breakthroughs, the ones who ask the question everyone else was too embarrassed to ask, who take the leap everyone else calculated away, they all share a common willingness to appear ridiculous. There's a reason the most innovative thinkers in history were called crazy before they were called geniuses. Einstein was dismissed. Tesla was mocked. Galileo was imprisoned. The fool always arrives before the revolution. Jung believed that within every psyche there is what he called the inferior function, the part of yourself you suppress the most, the side of you that feels underdeveloped and embarrassing. For a hyperlogical thinker, it might be emotional vulnerability. For someone deeply feeling and intuitive, it might be cold, rational analysis. Here's the unsettling truth. The thing you are most ashamed of in yourself is often the exact doorway to your greatest growth. The fool represents that doorway, and most of us have bricked it shut. Think about the last time you censored yourself. Maybe it was at work, maybe in a relationship, maybe on a first date. You had something genuine to say, something real, and instead you calculated how it would land, decided it was too weird, too much, too foolish, and you swallowed it. And in that moment, a little piece of what makes you you went underground. Do that enough times over a lifetime and you end up efficient, respectable, and completely hollow. Sound familiar? Drop in the comments. Have you ever held back something true because you were afraid of how it would come across? I want to know. But wait, here is what most people completely miss about the fool archetype. The fool is not actually stupid. In fact, across virtually every culture on Earth, from the Native American trickster myths to the court jesters of medieval Europe to the holy fools of Russian Orthodox Christianity, the fool is the one who tells the truth, not because he's brave in the conventional sense, but because he hasn't yet learned the social script that teaches people to be strategically silent. There's a story, a real psychological case study dressed in legend, about a king whose whole court was afraid to tell him his decisions were destroying the kingdom. Tax after punishing tax, war after pointless war. His advisors smiled and nodded, his generals polished their medals, and the only voice that ever told him the truth? The jester, the man in the bells and the ridiculous hat, because the fool is not trapped inside the game. He can see it for what it is, and that visibility, that terrifying clarity, is exactly what makes him so threatening to anyone who benefits from the illusion staying intact. This is why, psychologically, we tend to silence the fool inside ourselves, because telling the truth, even just to yourself, disrupts the comfortable story. And disruption is uncomfortable. But here's the paradox Jung spent his career documenting. The psyche that suppresses the fool doesn't become more stable. It becomes more rigid. And rigid things don't bend. They break. There's an ancient myth called the story of Parsifal, and it maps directly onto something that may be happening in your own life right now. Parsifal is a young, naive, deeply foolish boy. and he stumbles into an enchanted castle where a king lies wounded, not dead, not alive, just suspended in suffering. The entire kingdom is barren. And here is the thing. The prophecy says, the only person who can heal the king is an innocent fool who asks one simple question. But Parsifal, trained by a well-meaning mentor to be less of a fool, to stop asking so many questions, arrives at the castle, sees the suffering, and stays silent. Because he doesn't want to seem rude. He doesn't want to appear foolish. And the opportunity disappears. The castle vanishes. The kingdom stays broken. And Parsifal spends 20 years in the wilderness before finding his way back. When he finally does, he asks the question, just a simple, honest, heartfelt question, and the king is healed. The land becomes green again. The entire point of the myth is this: the fool's innocent question, the one you are afraid to ask, the one you think makes you sound naive or simple. That question is the medicine. Your suppressed foolishness is not a flaw in you. It is a function, and suppressing it has consequences. So here's where it gets personal. Psychology identifies something called the persona, the mask we wear to manage how others perceive us. And the more rigid your persona, the more disconnected you become from what Jungians call the self, the deeper, integrated, authentic center of who you are. The fool archetype is what cracks the persona, not violently, playfully. And that's the distinction. The fool doesn't destroy, he disrupts. He introduces enough lightness that the rigid structure can finally breathe. Now, you might be wondering, is there a shadow side to all this? Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the fool unchecked, the fool with no balance from what Jung called the sage, becomes something dangerous. He becomes the person who confuses impulsivity with freedom, who mistakes chaos for authenticity, who blows up their life calling it a spiritual journey. The fool needs the sage. The child needs the adult. The dreamer needs the planner. It is not about becoming reckless. It is about recovering the part of yourself that has been so buried under performance and perfectionism that you forgot it was there. There's a concept in Zen Buddhism called shoshin, beginner's mind. It means approaching everything you think you already know as if you're encountering it for the first time. No assumptions, no fixed identity tied to being the expert, just open, curious, present. That is the fool's natural state. And research in creativity, learning, and psychological resilience consistently shows that people who can access that state, who can tolerate not knowing, who can ask the embarrassing question, who can look a little ridiculous, those people adapt faster, create more, and report significantly higher levels of meaning and satisfaction in their lives. So what does this look like practically? It looks like sending the message you've been overthinking for a week. It looks like raising your hand in the meeting when you don't fully understand. It looks like starting the project before you feel ready. It looks like having the honest conversation instead of the comfortable one. The fool doesn't wait until conditions are perfect. He steps forward anyway, often not even fully aware of the cliff behind him. And sometimes he falls. But every time he falls, something grows in its place. Now, remember the question at the very beginning. What if the smartest thing you could ever do is to stop trying to look smart? Here's the answer. It is not about abandoning wisdom. It is about recognizing that wisdom without the fool is just fear wearing an intelligent costume. The most realized people throughout human history, the great healers, the transformative artists, the leaders who actually mattered, they all had the courage to be laughed at first. If something in this video cracked something open in you, if you recognized yourself somewhere in the story of the fool, in Parsifal's silence, in the jester's truth-telling, in the question you've been too afraid to ask, then you're in the right place. Because this channel exists to explore the parts of psychology that don't make it into self-help books, hit subscribe, because what we're building here is not content. It's a conversation about who you actually are underneath everything you've been taught to perform. And next time we are going all the way into the shadow, the darkest, most rejected part of the psyche that Jung believed holds the key to everything you want but can't seem to reach. You think you know what your shadow is. You don't. Not yet.